Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And we're going to try to cram a lot into the next few minutes. There's some news kind of outside Georgia, certainly around the SEC, and in some cases around college football. We're going to talk about that today. A very serious interview that Kirby Smart did with ESPN on Friday. We're going to cover some of that. We're going to ask the question of what happens now after what Smart has said and everything of the last week. Is all of this over now? We'll ask this here coming up before the show is done. But a lot of fun stuff before we get there, including another set of dominant performances by former Georgia players this past weekend at the NFL Scouting Combine. DawgNation was on hand to give you lots of coverage of that. The pages of DawgNation.com have been blistering here, giving you everything that's happened as a lot of former dogs make names for themselves ahead of the upcoming NFL draft. We're going to talk about what that means here on the show. We're going to just have some fun in sort of celebrating it all and just remarking at just how amazing it was that this level of athleticism put on display by UGA here once again. So we'll do that. We'll welcome in John Stinchcomb here as a part of the program today. It's going to be a good time. We are happy to have you with us for it as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So, quick story to start things off, and I know this is going to come across as just a little bit self-serving. I promise you this is not an ad. I'm being as genuine as I'm capable of here on this. So, last year, the single best thing that may have happened to me, or not the best thing, but the best moment, like you sort of remember your life in moments. Like the moment from last year that I think I'm going to really remember as much as anything. By last year, I mean a year ago around this time, is on the final night of our DawgNation cruise. We're sitting up there for a kind of private NFL draft party right at the top of Independence of the Seas. Beautiful night, perfect weather, big screen in front of us. And you were just watching name after name after name of former Georgia players being called in the NFL draft. Trayvon Walker was number 1 overall. You had 5 dogs in total drafted in the first round. And I remember thinking, as a punctuation mark to a great national championship season, the kind of celebration we were able to have to enjoy all of that, I just remember thinking, gosh, this is about as perfect as it gets. And, trying to, I guess, sort of be a little bit wise, you're like, boy, I better make sure I enjoy all of this because there aren't very many moments in a sporting life that'll ever be more enjoyable than this one feels here right now. You better take advantage of this. You better soak this in because where you are, what you're seeing happen, the culmination of this great championship season, life rarely works out to feel this perfectly. And yet, y'all, here we are a year later. And sure enough, our final night of this year's cruise is going to be the NFL draft. And sure enough, one of the big events we're going to be doing as part of our DawgNation cruise coming up next month is that NFL draft party once again. I don't tell you that to kind of pump up the cruise. By now, you're either coming or you're not, at least in all likelihood. But my point in telling you that is doesn't it feel like the best kind of history is repeating itself for Georgia once again? And maybe you will be on board with us. We'll celebrate all this together for our DawgNation cruise, or maybe you'll have your own draft party somewhere else. But one way or another, the thing that we saw last year, this degree of perfection of championship season and the NFL Scouting Combine turning into the NFL Draft becomes this unbelievable commercial for Georgia football. And as perfect and pristine as all that seemed, here we are a year later, and it seems like almost the exact same thing is happening again with just a different crop of names, at least on the basis of what we saw this past weekend during the NFL Scouting Combine. And we talked about this on Friday. Nolan Smith was the guy who kind of got all of this started, but it continued in a huge way over the weekend where you had a lot of guys who just went out there and just flat out dominated. I mean, Darnell Washington over the weekend, and I'm one of those guys, I'm just not going to live and die with some of this combine stuff. It's not my favorite thing to do. I've told you that before, and I repeat myself on that just to make sure I'm honest with you. It's not like I'm just, watching every second, nanosecond of what goes on here from Indianapolis, but I'm following it on social media because it's a fun conversation to follow. And it seems like, everything with Darnell was just, one level of praise after another for a guy that we've all seen dominate. And now the NFL draft scouts get a chance to see that themselves. In fact, there's one photo of Washington, and a lot of you saw this live, that sort of tells the story on this as he's kind of running one of those pass catch drills going towards the sideline, full extension with the big giant hand one-handed catch. I think we have this photo to show here. I mean, is that not amazing? What an unbelievable shot that is of Washington going. I pulled this off Mad Dog's Twitter feed. He has a Happy Sunday on there. But nonetheless, an amazing photo of Washington doing what he did, kind of encapsulating what Darnell Washington's sort of all about. Just sheer dominance when it comes to the NFL scouting combine. He is bigger. He is faster. One of those short cone, short cone style drills. One of those, drills just, designed to measure your kind of short range quickness. I saw where Darnell was the third fastest of anybody who ran in his, wide receivers, tight ends, whatever else. He was the third quickest of anybody on that, up there with guys like Jackson Smith and Njigba from Ohio State and players that you would think would be in a completely different category athletically because they're smaller and supposed to be quicker. And yet Darnell, even at his size, is doing the kinds of things that he did and getting a chance to tout himself during his press conference time about whether or not he is the best tight end. I love the way that he described this. I love the humility that he shows in talking about himself. But there's no doubt that Darnell knows that he brings a skill set to the table that very few players in college football were able to match. And as you start looking ahead to the upcoming NFL draft, very few players on that draft are going to be able to match this either. This is really, really good from Darnell Washington and why he believes that he's a special tight end worth paying attention to. He's right to say this. This is what he said in Indianapolis here this weekend.
I feel like I'm only scratching the surface. I feel like I'm a good blocker. I feel like I could turn into a great blocker. Good athlete currently. I feel like I'm going to turn into a great athlete. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface.
Do you think you're the best tight end in this draft, and why?
I feel like I'm the most unique tight end in the draft. I wouldn't say the best. I'm very humble, so yeah. I mean, you just see the size. I mean, I'm heavier than most of these tight ends. You just see the 40. So.
I had a chance to talk to Darnell a couple of times during the college football playoff, the lead up to the national championship, and I always found every conversation I had with him to be a lot like what you heard right there. A guy that's just kind of fun to talk football with. Darnell is clearly a unique specimen. He's right to point that out about himself. It's also interesting that he has, he says, I'm humble. I'm not going to call myself the best tight end in this draft, but I do believe I bring a unique skill set that other guys don't possess. I think he's right in saying that. And I think if you are coming at this from the standpoint that I kind of do, because I just like college football better than the NFL, so I sort of think of the NFL draft as what does it mean for Georgia football? If a guy like Darnell Washington is rewarded for his Georgia career by being a first-round pick, that's incredibly valuable to UGA because Darnell's one of those guys that was really asked to sort of be a team-first player at Georgia. He was a very special guy. He clearly showed some ability with the football in his hand. He could go catch the ball at Georgia, but he was also, I would say, we've heard Kirby Smart say this plenty, he was also kind of the engine that made so much of the Georgia offense move because of how effective he was as a blocker. In fact, in that same press conference, one of the reporters said, hey, you think about moving to offensive tackle. Poor Darnell has heard those questions his entire life because the honest truth is, if he devoted himself to be an offensive tackle, he might be Orlando Pace. He might be one of those guys that makes $100 million over the course of a 10-year career. But as a tight end who also catches the football, he's an extraordinary blocker too. And for Georgia, that's the kind of message that you would love to reverberate. That's the kind of message that you would love to resonate, that here's this unique talent, athletically, size-wise, everything else, devoted himself to a team concept at Georgia, was a willing blocker, made things happen for other playmakers, got a chance to be the playmaker in his own right from time to time, and the reward for doing that was a first-round draft pick selection and the kind of contract that goes along with that. You better believe that the Georgia machine would be greatly aided if the conversation that seemed to start around Darnell and the NFL scouting combine carries all the way through the month of April. But that's not the only Georgia prospect that I thought was pretty dominant based on what I could see and what I could tell from the weekend. I saw Broderick Jones just, moving around so well. Clearly this is a guy that when you watch, I'm talking about the Georgia left tackle, of course, when you watch the current conversation that's taking place around Broderick Jones, I think you're reminded of how valuable he was to UGA, starting with his insertion during the national championship game at the end of the 2021 season, but certainly continuing all throughout 2022, where Georgia got a high level of dominance the kind of thing that became a total security blanket for Stetson Bennett. You never really thought that much about Broderick just because he was doing his job to such a degree that you were able to think about other things. But when you see the way in which Broderick is being praised here, both in terms of some of the media stuff like mock drafts and things like that, but also the more credentialed decision makers, some of the things you're hearing them say about Broderick Jones too, you're reminded of just how special a player that Georgia's had over at that left tackle spot over the course of the last, we'll call it 16 games, because he slid in there at the end of the national championship game in 2021. But the point is that Broderick Jones has been a very special player for UGA. And the cool thing that was on display with the scouting combine, because of the kinds of drills you're asking those guys to do, this isn't just the kind of Georgia offensive lineman that maybe you've seen in the past, like what an Andrew Thomas might have been, or guys like that prior to that are just so big they just maul you, they just plant you into the turf. Jones at times has shown an ability to do that, but he's also an amazing athlete too, like an unbelievable sort of next level athlete for that offensive line position. And he had a very funny way of describing his own athleticism when he was doing his press conference this weekend too. Listen to the phrase that Broderick Jones uses here to kind of describe his ability to move around the football field. I really like this from Brod. Take a listen to this.
I think it helps me out a lot just being able to have these sweet feet. I think it puts my game on the next level. Just being able to go along with all my other attributes, just being able to have sweet feet. Started in high school, playing all different sports, playing basketball helped me a lot. Just being able to keep, just staying in sports. Really, that's all it was. That's really.
Let me tell you this. One thing I've never been accused of having in my life is sweet feet. I'm liable to trip and fall up and down the stairs, or going from the bedroom to the living room to the bedroom at night, like. What's the there's a lot of phrases I like around, I don't love the NFL pre-draft process, but I do like a lot of phrases that scouts use from time to time, like the dancing bear. I've never been accused of being a dancing bear at any point in time in my life, but Broderick Jones, he does have sweet feet. So getting a chance to pat yourself on the back for a little bit of sweet feet, I don't have a problem with that. And it's kind of one of those cool things where, okay, if you look at the Kirby Smart era at Georgia, you're talking about, originally it's Sam Pittman as offensive line coach. The mold then were the biggest human beings that existed on planet Earth. And these were guys, I said before, that were planting dudes in the turf. That's kind of what Georgia did. And then the transition to a Todd Monken offense and a Matt Luke as offensive line coach, you did see a little bit more like a Broderick Jones type of thing kind of in vogue there. And, a little bit slightly more athletic version of an offensive tackle compared to what the Andrew Thomas, Isaiah Wilson era might have been prior to that. Now, after 1 year of Stacey Searles, the one thing we know is the Georgia offensive line has certainly performed at a very high level. I believe it was the nation's best offensive line a year ago. Whether the Joe Moore Award, the award given to the top offensive line, realized it or not, I believe the Georgia offensive line was the very best. But it is kind of an interesting question. Okay, well, moving forward, is the Georgia offensive line going to be a little bit more like what Broderick Jones was, or a little bit more like what guys like Andrew Thomas might have been before that? I don't know that the answer to that's necessarily obvious, but the one thing you can expect based on what they did in 2022, it should be a high-level performance either way. But the bottom line is, when it comes to guys like Nolan Smith, we talked about on Friday's show, or guys like Darnell Washington, Broderick Jones over the weekend, unbelievable next-level UGA athletes, big for their position, athletic for their size. This was the story of the NFL Scouting Combine. A year ago, it was a national championship team that dominated Indianapolis, setting itself up for a big-time draft performance. It certainly seems like history is repeating itself once again, and if you're a UGA fan, that is a very fun thing to watch play out. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are presented today by Pella, window and door of Georgia. We're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app. We'll take a series of comments there. So if you're the kind of person that usually watches on another video platform, if you're lucky enough to be able to watch us live, 9:45 right there on the homepage, kind of our mothership type platform. You can stop by, you can see us there, you can get a little bit of extra interaction before the regular show begins at 10 a.m. We'd love to have you join us, or if you watch another video platform that's more convenient for you, hey, we try to make the show as available as we can on as many different platforms as we can. We love to be able to do that. Podcasts as well, Apple, Spotify, the Google Podcast Player, all that kind of stuff. We try to do that for you there too, and on the radio as well. Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, every day at noon. The kind of replay version of this show, you can check that out there as well. Just happy to have you with us. And a big thanks to our friends at Pella, Window and Door of Georgia for making it all possible. One of the things I'm really lucky about is a lot of my friends are kind of, in the construction industry or the kind of the home industry in some form or fashion. They kind of make their living with something connected to people's homes. And so I have a lot of conversations about, homes and trends and, home improvement, things like that. And like the one name that comes up for me so many times when I'm having these discussions is one of those things I talk to you about each and every week here on this show. I'm talking about Pella windows and doors, because homeowners in the Atlanta area, and this has been proven out by surveys and things like that year after year, recognize Pella windows and Pella doors as the true market leader when it comes to making your home look better on the outside, feel better on the inside, and really giving yourself the peace of mind that you're doing the best things possible in terms of protecting the value of your home and protecting the comfort of your home, which it provides for you and your family that lives there. So I love talking about Pella Window and Door of Georgia on this show each and every week. And in fact, my invitation to you is to go talk to somebody who is even better about talking about it than I am. I'm talking about one of those Pella experts that can give you a no-pressure consultation just to walk you through the complete product line, the installation options, in some cases the financing options, and all the ways in which you can get your house fitted with these Pella windows and doors. You can stop by and do that in the Experience Center right there in Duluth. I love the facility. It's awesome. We did a show there one time, and I saw the warehouse and saw all the stuff, and you can kind of put your hands on the product and sort of feel it and recognize what makes it different, recognize why it's so well respected. But you also have a chance to sort of start your shopping experience online if you want to there as well. You can go to PellaofGA.com/DawgNation. That's PellaofGA.com/DawgNation. You can also give them a call at 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Take advantage of great savings, because between now and March 26th, you can get 50% off qualifying installations, or no payments, no interest until 2024. That is why Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. All right, we're going to get John Stinchcomb coming up in a moment. We'll do a Marlowe's Tavern Insider update with him. We'll talk about all the stuff from the Scouting Combine. We'll also get into the serious stuff that Kirby Smart addressed during an ESPN interview on Friday. We haven't really had a chance to talk to John too much about that because the other stuff sort of broke last week, so we'll cover some of that with John here coming up in just a moment. Prior to that, though, let's go around the DawgHouse here today, and let's talk about another Georgia player and what I thought was a pretty strong combine performance, that coming from Georgia quarterback Stetson Bennett. Now, the Bennett situation a little bit different than guys like Broderick Jones, who probably solidified himself as a first-round pick. Guys like Nolan Smith and Darnell Washington, I believe, made a strong case for themselves as first-round picks to go along with Jalen Carter, who's obviously going to be a first-round pick. A guy like Keely Ringo, who might be a first-round pick. Once again, you're talking about Georgia with a possibility, and maybe it's even a strong possibility, of having as many as 5 first-round picks, the same number as they had a year ago. The Stetson Bennett situation, a little bit different in that Bennett's not likely to go in the first round, but Bennett certainly, I think, answered a lot of critics who wonder what kind of NFL draft prospect he is. Clearly, he's going to be drafted. And I'd say now, based on some of the chatter I'm observing after he threw this past weekend, a lot of you saw it, the velocity seemed good, kind of cranking it up there in excess of 59 miles an hour. The deep ball stuff seemed to be pretty strong. In fact, you compare Bennett's performance to quarterbacks, in many cases, are going to be taken far ahead of him this draft, at least expected to be. Certainly Stetson's performance wasn't left lacking in comparison to some of these guys who've gotten all kinds of draft praise. Clearly, Stetson Bennett has demonstrated the fact that he is very much an NFL prospect at the quarterback position, and his draft status, I think, now reflects that. He's obviously also doing a lot of this in the Combine in Indy, the same stadium that he helped lead Georgia to its first national championship in more than 40 years at the end of the 2021 season. And Bennett talked about the feeling of kind of being back there with his former Georgia teammates as they were on the ground in which Georgia history was made just a little over a year ago. Here was good stuff from Bennett on that.
We thought it was pretty cool. Walked in there. I love the stadium. I think the stadium's awesome. With I think it just looks like the city. So you remember that. I think the turf feels a little different than it did. It's definitely warmer. It was freezing. But yeah, it was special just walking in here. You don't think. I don't know. You just remember certain things, certain plays. Like a fumble that might have happened. But it was pretty cool.
No doubt that Indianapolis is a part of Georgia football history. I'll remember that, and I will tell you, we've been lucky here the last few years because Georgia's played in a lot of cool, interesting stadiums, NFL-type stadiums, and I'd say that Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis is a really cool venue. It's a fun place to be, and I don't know when, if ever, I'll have a chance to be there again, but watching a football game there and seeing the way that stadium kind of designed to look like a warehouse, sort of fit in with the rest of the Indianapolis skyline, that sort of, feeling around Indy, I'd say it was pretty cool. And something else that was pretty cool there as well is watching the way that Stetson Bennett performed. I mean, here's the one thing we all have to acknowledge. That literally everyone, and I do mean everyone, unless your last name is Bennett, the honest truth is that you are probably a little late to the game on Stetson Bennett. Everything that Bennett has done every step of the way, to some extent, has been unexpected. This was true from the very first game he ever played in, or at least, first game of the 2020 season was not Bennett's first experience ever. But the first experience of the 2020 season, coming in and saving Georgia's bacon at Arkansas, that wasn't expected. Certainly in 2021, when JT Daniels was injured and not able to play against UAB, that huge, eye-popping statistical performance, that wasn't expected either. And then becoming the guy at quarterback for Georgia shortly after that, and Bennett being the one that actually led Georgia to the national championship, that was certainly unexpected too. To come back and repeat that, for a lot of people, that was also an unexpected performance there as well. To now be, I would say, solidly in the conversation of draftable quarterbacks, and a guy that's likely to be drafted now higher than a lot of folks would have thought, that's also unexpected there as well. Even the Georgia coaches themselves have admitted, hey, we didn't see this coming either. They had a chance to kind of cast themselves as the smart ones in the story, the ones that sort of saw this all along. They've readily acknowledged that Stetson Bennett even kind of snuck up on them too. So Georgia fans don't necessarily have to apologize for anything for the fact that Bennett and his success and his continued repeated success has been a surprise, and the kind of thing that sneaks up on you. Everybody has probably experienced the same kind of thing. But at a certain point, you just sort of have to acknowledge what it is, that Stetson Bennett is a better quarterback than almost anyone thought he'd ever have a chance to be. The argument has been over and settled for a long time. Bennett is just good. And it wasn't necessarily supposed to be this way. He wasn't necessarily supposed to be the guy. And maybe he wasn't even supposed to be the draft prospect that he seems to kind of be turning into. But that's what it is now. And at a certain point, it's time to sort of stop arguing about it and just sort of appreciate it for what it is. Stetson Bennett now putting himself into a pretty fun NFL draft conversation on the heels of what was a historic career at the University of Georgia. We'll make that around the DawgHouse. Now, before we're done on today's show, I'm going to let you get a chance to hear some of what Kirby Smart said on Friday on ESPN. Much more serious topic, very, very different than the fun stuff that we're doing here right now. But a lot of folks that wanted to hear from Kirby Smart, well, now you have. And so it'd be weird if we didn't play some of it for you. So we're going to do that here coming up before we're all said and done. A couple different clips I want to give you from the Kirby Smart interview with Mark Schlabach, ESPN, on Friday. We will do that. There's also interesting news around the SEC and kind of the broader sense in college football. We're going to cover some of that for you around the SEC coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, just how successful was this NFL scouting combine for UGA? For guys like Bennett, we just mentioned, the guys like Broderick Jones, Darnell Washington, or Nolan Smith going back to late last week. Let's cover all of that right now with our good friend John Stinchcomb. We call it a Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. Let's speak to him right here today on DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So bringing John Stinchcomb here, Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update with him here today. And, John, I started my show today by saying that so much of what has happened for Georgia over the course of the last few days feels so much like what happened a year ago. And the reason why I kind of find that to be so remarkable is because, I was led to believe, or I kind of convinced myself a year ago of, hey, you better appreciate all this while it's happening. You better enjoy this because life is not like this typically. You don't typically have the NFL draft stand as such a commercial for your favorite team. It doesn't typically become such a perfect punctuation mark to a championship season. That last year was special. You better enjoy it as special, and you better treat it as unique because it may not ever be like this again. And here we are a year later, and it's darn near the same stuff going on again. Different names, but the same kind of combine dominance, the same kind of, in a lot of ways, commercial for UGA, especially some of the stuff that Nolan Smith said going back to the end of last week, that it is a amazing level of history, and the best kind of history in this case, repeating itself for UGA. Is that kind of the way you experienced this yourself over the weekend?
Absolutely. Once again, we find ourselves in these moments where you're going, this is special, and you don't have to look back and say, man, those were the good old days. These are the good old days. And the way Georgia continues to produce and develop talent, and anytime given an opportunity to prove how special it is in Athens right now, they've taken advantage of that. And I think that's what really is continuing to be foremost is Georgia's ability to, given the opportunity, to show what an elite program they've become. And this weekend and this past week at the Combine is no different.
So I think the Darnell Washington thing here is maybe one of the more interesting parts of all of this is because, Georgia clearly has viewed Darnell as a unique specimen. Darnell himself kind of, talked about his own kind of unique attributes. But it's also one of those things where, hey, Georgia asked Darnell to do something pretty significant, which is forego your individual glory, help us make the entire team good, and when we can get you touches, we're going to do that. When we can reward you, we're going to do that. If you can become a first-round pick at a place like Georgia by really emulating that sort of team-first mindset that Darnell made kind of the hallmark of his game here over the course of the last couple of years, John, of all the stuff we may say kind of in this pre-draft buildup, that might be the most valuable part of this is because there aren't a lot of players who maybe would willingly volunteer to be as unselfish, I believe, as Darnell Washington became at UGA. But if it works out to the tune of a huge payday, how valuable is that for the future of Georgia football for this to become a proof of concept that they can kind of keep throwing back out year after year after year?
Well, it's 2 years in a row where this has happened. I think Quay Walker would be one to chime in and say, you buy into the Georgia way, you invest into the program, and even though it may not be what outsiders say is a traditional format, it pays off for you. And Darnell is another example of Georgia saying, hey, we've got a vision for you, and it's not going to cost you. It will benefit you in the long run. And, he's a uniquely gifted and talented football player, and I think he would find success no matter which program he was in. But the way Georgia developed him, the way they used him, only highlighted and progressed his game to the point where he is the multifaceted weapon that any NFL team's looking at going, we've got a guy who potentially is an inline blocking tight end, which seems to be one mold, and also a threat in the passing game that, anybody who's looking for red zone offense, which is 32 teams in the NFL, says, I want this guy. I want the opportunity to throw to that big old frame that can move down the field at a pace that is pretty impressive for any tight end, much less one that's his size.
When you look at Broderick Jones, who, what I saw, an amazing level of athleticism, I think we kind of knew that's what he was, and I kind of talked about this before you joined us, is like you look at the different sort of sub-eras of the Kirby Smart era when it comes to, it's Sam Pittman to begin with. These are the largest humans on earth, just sort of planting people in the turf. And then the Matt Luke era, kind of coinciding with the start of the Todd Monken era, is about the more athletic Broderick Jones style offensive lineman. I'm probably oversimplifying this, but that's kind of the caricature I'm going to draw there. If you have the two starkly different types of, offensive linemen, Pittman and Matt Luke, just for the sake of conversation, what do you see the future of Stacey Searels being? A little bit more like what Luke was, a little bit more like what Pittman would have been before that?
Well, I think it's much more to do with the evolution of offenses and what Georgia has been able to produce and how they've been able to produce. There's still space for, those run-heavy offenses where you pound away and then take your play-action pass options when they avail themselves. That exists in the NFL. You look at Baltimore as a great example of it, and at times Kansas City as well. I mean, there's others, right? So it's not a dying concept that's going away from the game. But you look at the way Monken has attacked teams, and it's a much more versatile, option-oriented, whatever you give us, we're going to take advantage of system. And I think that plays more to your traditional, combination of athletic and size offensive linemen, which is where Broderick falls, and Warren McClendon, and it's probably not quite your Isaiah Wilsons of the world, which were huge, and Ben Cleveland, those huge monsters that can lean on and pound people. So, I think there's still space for both, but I think where Georgia is right now and who knows what it looks like as Bobo starts his era as offensive coordinator. But I think it most likely looks more like the Monken system of options, variability, and a good mix of run, pass, spread concepts.
We talked about Stetson Bennett here for a moment because I feel like I'm a pretty pro-Bennett figure in terms of the fact that, I've been kind of in favor of Stetson Bennett being better than some people thought for a long time. And yet, John, even with being that kind of, sports talker, I still feel like I've even underrated Stetson Bennett at times there too, because here we are on the basis of his combine performance. Some of this will kind of settle down and maybe, prevailing wisdom will kind of, restore itself at some point in time. But it seems like on the basis of what Bennett did in the combine over the weekend, that he's likely, I always expected him to be drafted, but he's likely to be drafted higher than I assumed that he possibly would. And I start looking at Bennett in comparison to guys who were expected to be taken well ahead of him, and I'm left to wonder, okay, well, what exactly is the argument for these other guys necessarily? For instance, a guy that I love is Bryce Young. I'm a Falcons fan. I'd love for Bryce Young to be with the Falcons. I don't think it's going to work out that way. But if Bryce Young was the future of the Atlanta Falcons, I think I'd be pretty happy about that. Take my chances with him being a really good quarterback. And then you start to wonder, okay, well, Bennett measured, as well, if not better than Bryce Young did. He won 2 championships in college. Bryce Young didn't win any. I still believe that Young should be drafted well ahead of Stetson Bennett. I'm not saying that I don't. But you start to wonder, okay, well, what is the knock on Bennett from a draft standpoint if, he threw well in the combine, he clearly won in college. What do you think of Stetson Bennett's kind of draftable status based on the entirety of his career at UGA, what you may have seen from him in the combine? How good of an NFL prospect is he really in your mind?
I think he is a good prospect. So that's a mid-round guy. I think there are some limitations there. There's limitations in, his size and stature. But look at this draft class, and Bryce Young is a great comparison because he's not your 6'5", 235 QB like what your prototype is. And look across the NFL, and that's not the case anymore. I mean, Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray. I mean, the list of guys that are not huge, that aren't towering over the offensive line, or at least looking eye level with them, of starting NFL quarterbacks, Russell Wilson included. There's plenty that aren't huge in stature, and there's space for guys like Stetson who can create with their feet when asked or when called upon, but also are good pocket quarterbacks. And I think he continues to, just watch him play, watch the work that he puts in, watch what he did in the combine, and you say, why would we not? And that's probably what he had to overcome when he was at Georgia twice, and the last time being obviously pretty fruitful for once you say, hey, let's give this guy a shot. And I think NFL teams are hopefully a little more judicious, although their track records are not great considering how many guys they draft and versus how many guys that are undrafted that end up on rosters. So I don't know if that's a stellar sheet that they've got as a history record, but for Stetson, I think there's great opportunity for him to go to the NFL and find success and stick around for a good long while if, all the other intangibles of preparation and, not making bug-headed decisions away from the game.
Sure.
Continue to be a part of what he offers a program.
So let me ask you this. So you play with Drew Brees, and like the NFL draft guys will tell us, hey, if you're shorter, like 6 foot or under, it really is hard to see the middle of the field during the NFL game. But there really is a penalty on not being tall enough to see over the pocket, tall enough to see over the offensive line. Well, clearly Drew Brees is the outlier that goes against that because of obviously how good he was and you played with him. How come it wasn't more of a problem for Drew Brees, John? How come Brees was so able to avoid this? Just because he was just so, dadgum accurate or whatever else? Were there moments privately where Brees wished he was taller? Like what, how come Brees was able to succeed at this sort of the 6 foot mark? We're kind of told that's the sort of height that it makes it very hard to be a successful quarterback.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of folks that talk about the game that probably don't know it very well. Drew never had the opportunity to play at 6'5", so the only way he knew how to play it was at borderline 6 feet tall.
Right.
And you find those lanes, you find where you need to set up in the pocket, and I think he was able to find a great deal of success doing so. And he's not the only one. You look at the list of quarterbacks now, and there's I'd say almost a third of the league that is under, let's call it 6'2", and starting and having varying degrees of success there. So I think they've widened the the prototype still is 6'4", 6'5", sees over the line, has a cannon for an arm, sure, all those things. Well, personal experience, I played against Robert Mathis, Pro Bowl, perennial Pro Bowl defensive end. And you look at him, and with all due respect, he was not intimidating. It wasn't a very impressive package, but yet the guy can just play football. And at the end of the day, that's what any NFL team is looking for is, I want somebody who can produce. And Stetson is certainly that guy, even if it's not the numbers. I played for an offensive line coach who would say, I prefer the big, monstrous 350 players, but at the end of the day, I want somebody who can produce. And so as long as you're out there making plays and performing for your team, that's the recipe for success. And if it doesn't fit the mold or the prototype of what a position should look like, at the end of the day, who really cares? I want somebody who can perform and produce.
Let me ask you to kind of keep your NFL analyst hat on for a second. I want to kind of broaden this out beyond just Georgia for a moment, because the other draft conversation, it seems like we're doing our comment sections and things like this for this show. This kind of comes up a lot, that there is some NFL team out there that's going to take a chance on a quarterback and the top end of the first round who I would say just wasn't very good in college. Anthony Richardson had a very good NFL scouting combine, but, I don't think you have to be kind of chief Gator hater like me to say that Richardson just wasn't that good in college. And Will Levis is another example of this where, you see some of these, ESPN-type pundits, foaming at the mouth to praise Will Levis. John, I don't think Will Levis is very good in college either, not either of the last 2 years. So, now Josh Allen wasn't that good in college either, and he's one of the best players in the NFL. And I would say even a guy like Daniel Jones is probably better in the NFL than he was in college. So I want to ask you what might seem like a simplistic question, but I mean this genuinely. How much is not being all that good in college? How much does that matter when it comes to having a chance to be very good in the NFL?
Yeah, it's such a strange deal, and I think if anyone was ever able to figure it out, what exactly you're looking for as to how it will translate to success, then they could make a small mint worth of money, because it's yet to be solved. There's always those years where you think, golly, I'm not sure how this guy's going to perform, and they far exceed your expectations. Obviously, Brady is the best example of that. And then the flip side of the coin is this guy can't miss. You know what I mean? He's going to be great in the pros, and it just doesn't seem to ever come to fruition. That's why we can look back to those drafts 6 or 7 years down the road and say, wow, you couldn't have been more wrong about Sam Darnold or any of that class, where there's other guys that seem to slip through and get picked up later and say, man, how did we not see this? And that's what makes it so difficult. You look at guys that weren't quite as successful in college, and you're questioning, was it a system fit? Did they have players around them that could make plays? Were they always under duress? And it really does affect your ability to evaluate, because you're not looking at apples to apples ever. It's always, there's so many other mitigating circumstances that affects the ability to evaluate how they will look once they get in your system with the players that you can surround them with. And that's a big factor in their ability to succeed.
It's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update with John Stinchcomb. And, of course, he is our Dog Nation Insider on this show each and every week. But you yourself have a chance to be a Marlowe's Tavern Insider And you get great incentives just for doing that. In fact, when you sign up, you're actually going to get $10 off a $30 order there at Marlowe's Tavern just for signing up. It's also free to join, which is a really good thing there as well. But once you're a part of the Marlowe's Tavern Insider Club, you're going to get what they call qualified visits. So when you go to the tavern, including the one right there in your neighborhood, and spend at least $15, that earns you a qualified visit. When you get up to 4 qualified visits, you're going to then get a great reward, a complimentary entree reward up to $20 on your next visit to Marlowe's Tavern. So it's free to join. Go to marlowestavern.com for a lot more on that. That is marlowestavern.com for more on that. Of course, great to have John Stinchcomb as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. All right, so John, there's a lot of fun stuff going on around UGA. We love talking about that. There's also some serious stuff there as well. We learned last week about Jalen Carter's presence at the accident that obviously resulted in loss of life for Devin Willock and Chandler LaCroix going back to January. There were some misdemeanor charges given to Carter because of that. Athens police revealed last week. We heard from Kirby Smart on Friday on ESPN about all of this. John, we really haven't heard from you since the Carter thing became known. So I guess let me start with kind of a broad question, then I'll follow up after that. What do you think about the news that we've learned as of late?
Yeah, I think we keep the main thing, and it's my heart hurts still for the loss of life. Anytime you lose members of really DawgNation or just across the board, young folks that die, it's brutal. It hurts, and that's what's most important is recognizing that no matter what the circumstances are, that's 2 lives that were cut way short, and how unfortunate it is. And for Jalen, for really everybody involved, I'm sure there's a level of pain that we can't even relate to, that just being a part of that situation and losing a brother and a sister or 2 folks that you really love, it hurts. And when you're young and you it's not an excuse, but you make mistakes, sometimes the price you pay for those is really high. And I think that's what's most unfortunate about it is those were mistakes. There were mistakes that were made, and it cost 2 people their lives, and that's what's sad. Now for Jalen, it's still speculation as to what his involvement is with it, or how it did impact Chandler's ability to drive, and whether or not there was racing. To me, that's inconsequential. What matters most is just trying to recognize the loss that was incurred, and I think Georgia does. I heard Coach Smart talk about the culture and the many folks that he brought in, and really the entire athletic department brings in to try to pour into the young men of the football team and really all the student athletes across the University of Georgia, and teach them the right way and create a culture there where you minimize the opportunities for devastating loss like they just experienced. And at the end of the day, I think there's some things that you just can't control. I know when I was a rookie going in the NFL, they have the rookie symposium, and there's a number of speakers and professionals in their field that are giving you good financial advice and the do's and don'ts and warnings of the hazards that exist in the NFL and what comes around with it. And there's always going to be folks that are sleeping in the back of those meetings. And so despite the fact that your best efforts are to prevent people from hurting themselves and hurting others and making some mistakes that they'll regret down the road, you can only do as much as you're capable. And there comes a point, I think we all can relate to this, where there's individual ownership of, folks aren't always going to make the best decisions. And, in this particular case, it hurts even more. And I'm sure the because of the society we live in today, we're all going, well, how can we prevent this? And, I think we continue to try to look at ways to empower and educate and let folks know the hazards that exist, and try to minimize the opportunities for such a tragedy to occur.
Let me ask you this, and it's not easy to know this, but we've heard from Kirby Smart now. We're going to play some of this audio on the show in a moment. We've heard from the Athens police. They released their statement last week. Jalen Carter's camp has intimated they're going to bring some new evidence at some point in time, so we'll, I guess, hear more from them. And I think there's a chance we hear more from Devin Willock's family at some point in time. But is this kind of the beginning of the end of this as a story? Are we starting to see a corner turned here in terms of this being, kind of a story that gives new information? Is all the new information out at this point, John? I know you don't know that, so I don't know how I expect you to answer this, but I am curious what you think anyway.
I think, my hope would be that yes, it would be, and we can move on with the grieving process, but my head says that probably not. It seems like there's still more discovery that could take place, or more aspects of the story that could come to light. And I get it, but I think what would be most healthy for everyone is the ability to move forward and mourn and do the best we can to learn from this situation and move past what it is. I think if given the knowledge that we have now and understanding of what transpired and all the various aspects, it's a clear enough picture to me to have at least a loose understanding of what happened. And it's sad, and it's mistakes were made and it cost people their lives, but I don't think we're done with it, if you will. That this is something that because of the way we process through things on so many different levels, that I'm sure there's more to come from it. And I'm probably not what's healthiest, but it's the way we seem to process through these kind of tragedies.
John, very good stuff. Thank you so much for being here. I know that's not a fun subject to talk about, but your word's obviously very valuable to us, so we appreciate that. It's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. We'll look forward to talking to you very soon on much happier subject matter, at least we hope, in the weeks to come.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. I look forward to more discussions on football, and I'm sure everyone else does. But,
for sure.
It's part of life is recognizing that outside of the entertainment value that football brings, these are men that are involved in it, and they have lives too, and sometimes we can relate to them in all too real ways. So I get it, and I appreciate the opportunities to just be a dog and a part of this family, and it's always great to be a dog. So I appreciate the opportunity, BA, that you provide on a weekly basis for us to come and talk about something that we have a true love and passion for.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, brother. Go Dogs.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, not an easy discussion, but probably a necessary one. I thought John had good words on that, and we will let you hear some of what Kirby Smart said on Friday on ESPN. If you missed that, we'll do that before we are all set and done. How about, before we get to that, though, much happier subject matter, cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, as I told you at the top of the show, and this was not an ad when I say it. This is an ad, but when I said it at the top, it wasn't an ad. I cannot wait to be on board Independence of the Seas this upcoming April, final night of the cruise. I'm talking about it's just perfect. Up there at the top, and this year our cruise is so much larger than it was a year ago. We're actually kind of commandeering an entirely different level of this. So we're like, it's almost like the coolest rooftop bar you've ever been. But top of the ship, their Independence of the Seas for the ultimate draft party. Last year we saw 5 names mentioned from UGA player ranks. This year have a chance to match that number again, maybe. But you better believe every time one of those names gets called, hooping and hollering, all that kind of stuff coming from our DawgNation draft party on board Independence of the Seas. It's going to be an awesome time. Jessica Slater's a great travel agent. She's helped us with this every step of the way. And if you want to get involved, either last-minute chance on the DawgNation cruise, or you want your own Royal Caribbean cruise. By the way, we've got a golden shoe coming up from somebody on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. We'll talk about that here coming up in a moment. Jessica, great name to know. You can call her directly, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also visit royaldogs.com. That is royaldogs.com. And you can get in on the fun that is the DawgNation cruise and all the other great stuff going on with Royal Caribbean here right now. So, on Friday, near the end of our recording, I actually mentioned this on our podcast, Cool Down, but didn't have it for the regular broadcast. So Nick Saban, I guess, has found out about the permanent opponents that Alabama's supposed to have when the SEC is believed to extend itself to a 9-game conference schedule with the 3 permanents. And Nick Saban's not too happy about it. Nick Saban, listen, you can add this to the list of things he sort of whined about over the course of the last few years. But he's not happy because Alabama's going to be playing Auburn, Tennessee, and LSU each season, according to the reporting from Sports Illustrated here. Now, the only surprise in this particular case is LSU, because any scheduling model has to include the Iron Bowl, and it has to include third Saturday in October, the Alabama-Tennessee rivalry. There are only a handful of SEC rivalries that have to be played, and I would say that there are only a couple of teams that have 2 of them, Georgia and Alabama being those. Georgia's got to play Florida every year, and it's got to play Auburn every year. Alabama has to play Auburn every year and then has to play Tennessee every year. Now, the team that gets messed up by all this is poor old Auburn. They got to play Alabama and Georgia every year on the basis of what we sort of think is to have to as it relates to this, kind of conference tradition and things like that. That's why a lot of people believe they may get thrown the bone of playing a team like Vanderbilt or something as their third opponent because they got to play Alabama and Auburn every year. Ultimately, here's what I believe. And I've been thinking a lot about this because some of the chatters out there now, well, actually, you think Georgia may play South Carolina. Georgia may actually play somebody completely different than that. I think ultimately we probably make a little too much out of the 3 permanent opponents. Like, this seems like a really big deal now because this is the news we're waiting to hear confirmation on. But eventually, when you get to the actual SEC schedule, you're going to be playing every team in the SEC every 2 years. So, your 3 permanent opponents, when 2/3 of your league schedule is not going to be permanent, it's going to be rotating every year, eventually every SEC schedule is going to look pretty close to the same. I'm not actually quite so sure how much the permanent opponents are going to actually overall affect the schedule balance within the league. So Nick Saban's whining and complaining right now. He wants it to be easy. A lot of folks at that stage of life kind of do. But in this particular case, I don't know that the Alabama schedule is all that different playing LSU every year compared to playing LSU every other year when you think about the other kinds of teams that you play. Plus, it's sort of hard to imagine. Okay, so what – I'm going to make this quick and we can move on. Like, what counts as a tough opponent? Is it a team like Tennessee, which is good now but hasn't been good for most of the last 20 years? Is it Oklahoma, which is kind of bad now but has been good for most of the last 20 years? Is it Texas, which always seems to underachieve, but from a recruiting ranking standpoint is always ranked high? Is it a team like Auburn that's really bad now, but if you look over the course of the last 50 years, it's probably a top 25 team more often than not? If I were to ask you, hey, going forward, if you want the easiest schedule, who would you want to play? Well, obviously a team like Vanderbilt is the easiest example there, but what really counts as tough and what really counts as easy, given the fact that so much of this is defined over the course of many, many years? So from that standpoint, I think that Nick Saban is literally the old man yelling at clouds when it comes to all of this. Speaking of change, there's a lot of change on the way to college football, and we now have reason to believe, based on some of the rule recommendations from some of these committees, and Kirby Smart and I spoke about this last week, that we've got big changes coming on the rule front as well. And all of this with the design of shortening college football games. Not shortening the commercial breaks, but shortening the actual action on the field a little bit. The word they use now is exposures. The number of times a player has a chance to kind of collide with another player, limiting those exposures. And some of the ideas here, some of this is not controversial really at all. They want to get rid of the untimed downs at the end of the first and third quarter, whereas there's a penalty on the defense. Typically that results in an untimed down at the end of the game, end of the half. Of course you'd want that. First and third quarter, there's no really reason to do that because the drive just continues on the other side of the quarter break. So getting rid of that, getting rid of the opportunity to take a consecutive timeout. This is often, icing the kicker situation where you call a timeout, you call another timeout, eliminating that ability to take back-to-back timeouts as a way of shortening the game. The more controversial stuff, and it's not really controversial, but the more debatable topics are, at least one point in time, is kind of kicked around the notion they may leave the clock running after an incomplete pass, something the college football does not do right now. This would greatly reduce the number of plays in a game if you had the clock running during all of this. And the one change I believe that's likely to happen, is probably going to happen, is keeping the clock running after a first down. One of the things that makes college football different than the NFL is the fact the NFL clock does keep running like this. Currently, the college football clock doesn't, but inside of 2 minutes, last 2 minutes of the first half, last 2 minutes of the game, you would stop the clock after a first down, but you wouldn't do that for the other 56 minutes during the game. So this seems like it's on its way to happening, and the games are going to have a reduced number of plays because of that. So I think one of the things that's kind of interesting to kind of kick around here is, well, what exactly will a reduced number of college football plays mean for the games that we see on a sort of Saturday to Saturday basis? Once again, Georgia's probably impervious to whatever. I mean, Georgia just sort of seems to be the outlier in everything. That rules just don't have much of an impact on Georgia because, while it just sort of seems like Georgia likes playing with fewer plays and, they just sort of seem to dominate no matter what. So they're probably an outlier in all of this no matter just whatever. Georgia's going to handle the situation whatever it is. But for the rest of college football, my first thought was, well, if you're going to take away these sort of clock stops and things like that you might reduce the number of upsets. But the truth is, mathematically, that's actually probably not the case. If you think about what makes a better team better, like the definition of being better is on a per-play basis, you're more successful. And that, from that line of thinking, not to get too math nerdy here, is that if you're the team that's the better team, then on a per-play basis, you're more successful. Your defense gets more stops. Your offense gets more explosives or efficient plays. Then you want the larger sample size of the game. You want as many plays as possible during the game because it just gives you more chances to win. That really, in the future, if we really are going to have a reduced number of plays, even a small reduction in the number of plays, it does probably favor the underdog in a game just slightly. Maybe not against Georgia because Georgia seems to thrive in games with a small number of plays in a way that almost kind of belies the math. But for everybody else, a smaller number of plays, I think mathematically probably helps the underdogs a little bit. If you're smarter than me, maybe you could help kind of weigh in on that. But if we do see these changes occur, it'll certainly reduce comebacks. Right? If you're down by 3 scores, it's going to be harder for you to come back if the clock's not stopping quite as much. But in terms of, hey, who benefits, favor or underdog, I think underdog probably benefits just slightly. Am I right about that? Yeah, tell me what you think about that. And then finally there's this. And I kind of want to read this just for a second because it's been out there for a couple of days. I've been meaning to get to it. We just haven't. Andrea Adelson had a story the other day about the future of the ACC. And the basic gist of it is this, is the ACC has a very long media rights deal in place. And with the new SEC deal about to kick in, with the new Big Ten deal about to kick in, the imbalance financially between the SEC, Big Ten, and a league like the ACC is really becoming more stark. Now, this also coincides with what's happening right now with the Big 12 and the Pac-12 sort of fighting over their new media rights deal, and one of those leagues may have a hard time surviving in the future. That's at least a possibility. But the ACC has the opposite problem. It's got a media rights deal in place, but it's so paltry from a financial standpoint compared to leagues like the Big Ten and the SEC that anybody in the ACC that thinks it could go somewhere else would like to, but contractually, the best that I can tell, sort of prohibited from being able to do that. So one of the folks kind of speaking out here is Florida State Athletic Director Michael Alford. When it comes to the situation, in the ACC, telling ESPN, I'm going to read here, at the end of the day, for Florida State to compete nationally, something has to change moving forward. Adelson writes, the numbers are stark. In a few years, the new TV deals for the SEC, Big Ten are going to kick in. They're going to provide member institutions in those leagues with $30 to $40 million more annually than Florida State's going to receive from the ACC. So that's the example here that's being talked about of, hey, would leagues like the Big Ten or the SEC try to absorb some of these ACC teams? But here's the one thing that I'm not quite so sure about, and I'm going to try to learn more about this. I'm curious to hear what smart people say about this. You see this a little bit in like the Pac-12, Big 12 stuff that's going on, which is, hey, the Big 12 may try to absorb like Arizona State, Utah, Colorado. They call those the four corners schools because they're in states that kind of have those sharp, rigid corners. They sort of look like boxes. They're called the four corners states. They may try to absorb those. But financially right now, it is not obvious how much other conferences gain by conference expansion. In other words, when the SEC took on Oklahoma and Texas, it was obvious that you'd want to add those teams if you could because those are really big brands. And when the Big Ten looked to add USC, UCLA, it was obvious from a financial standpoint you'd want to have Los Angeles in your league footprint because it's the second biggest city in America. But now when it comes to programs like Florida State, Clemson, even Miami maybe, whereas clearly your league gets more competitive by having programs like that in it, financially speaking, it's not obvious to me that there's a whole lot to be gained from that. First of all, because the SEC already has a big presence in Florida. Just use Florida State as an example. And if you want to look at Clemson there as well, the SEC's already in South Carolina. Plus the previous conference expansion that took place when, like, say, Missouri, Texas A&M came to the SEC around 2012. You know, that was back in a time in which the entirety of this conversation was dominated by the old school cable bundle, whereas you wanted to be in big cities, new markets to kind of increase your cable TV footprint. But there's a reason why now we call these media rights deals and not just cable TV deals, because a lot of this, I don't know that a ton of this is going to be streaming based, but the idea of overall viewers' eyeballs, no matter where you're located, that's kind of more important now than maybe it would have been back in the days when it was sort of exclusively cable bundle that we were talking about as the driving force behind a TV deal. So the bottom line on all this is, because I'll probably talk more about this than I need to, is that if you're not the Big Ten of the SEC, your league's future is very much in doubt. I honestly don't know if we'll have a Pac-12 in a few years. And I think the folks in the Pac-12 don't know that either. And now all of a sudden the ACC is kind of in the same situation where there are clearly some hands in the air of some of the league's better programs saying, hey, we'd like to get out. But I'm not exactly so sure there's anywhere for them to go. Florida State's a good football team, but does it make financial sense for that program to be in your league? Are you going to make more money for having them? I don't know the answer to that question is obviously yes, which kind of puts the future for all this in doubt. So very, very interesting times. Clearly the SEC and the Big Ten are growing by leaps and bounds. The rest of the leagues, it's not even obvious they'll exist within a few years. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, all of this, no big problem for UGA right now because it's the reigning back-to-back national champions. And if you're happy about that, we have a great way for you to be able to celebrate that. That's with our friends at Jittery Joe's. Let me reach down and show this to you, because you've seen me show this off before, and I am so proud of this. Jittery Joe's, obviously great coffee. A lot of you already kind of know this there as well. It's kind of one of those staples in the Athens area. And they've got this great commemorative can to not only celebrate the great Jittery Joe's coffee, which is inside the can, but also showcase Georgia's national championship here. The Power G there on the top, the back-to-back national championship logo. You kind of roll the can around. You see moments from the season, recapping all the games. Some of the great, history of Georgia football kind of on display here there as well. You love collector's items to go along with your national championship. Well, guess what? That's what Jittery Joe's provides for you there as well. So you can go to jitteryjoes.com to find out how you can pick one of these up. The great coffee that kind of comes from the great region of the world where great coffee is made. jitteryjoes.com, that delicious Jittery Joe's coffee inside this commemorative tin celebrating Georgia's back-to-back national championships. Check this out at jitteryjoes.com today to be able to enjoy all of that. All right, before we wrap things up on our program today, let's get serious again here for another minute and talk about a couple of pieces of news that are out there. First of all, as many of you are aware, the felony charge against Ra Thomas has been dropped. So I'm going to read here from DawgNation.com just to make sure I get all the facts on this correct. Connor Riley had this story going back over the weekend. The felony false imprisonment charge against Ra Thomas has been reportedly dismissed, according to Chip Towers' Atlanta Journal-Constitution. According to Thomas's lawyer, he's entered a pretrial diversion program to deal with the misdemeanor family violence charge. He's also taking anger management classes and in the process of completing 40 hours of community service. So there you go. It seems like the Thomas situation heading for a resolution there. There's a reason why we don't say much about this stuff when it first happens, because we want the legal process play out. Oftentimes it's complicated. In the case of Thomas, it seems to be playing out in his favor, I guess. It also kind of bolsters what we've sort of believed is true now for a while, which is that Rod Thomas is going to be on this team in 2023, including going through spring practice here coming up in just a few days. So more details on that at DawgNation.com. And also on Friday, as we talked to John Stinchcomb about a moment ago, Kirby Smart showed up on SportsCenter to address the incident involving, the traffic accident going back to January, the details that we learned about Jalen Carter this past week. And I thought that Smart gave a forceful defense of his program, which he has certainly a right to do, including some of the debate about, what Georgia knew, when it knew it, related to some of this kind of stuff, that Smart feels like that in some respects his program has unfairly been painted in a bad light. This is what Smart said about the actual facts from his perspective and what's going on with UGA as it tries to make sense of the accident that cost Devin Willick, Chandler McCoy their lives, and the involvement of Jalen Carter in this in some form or fashion. This is one of the things from Kirby Smart on SportsCenter on Friday on that.
I think there's a misconception out there that we may know more than other people, or there's this misperception that we're trying to hide something. We're in search of information too, and we don't get all that information. So we'll cooperate fully with authorities and give them all the information we can.
So that's Smart on that. At the end of this interview, Mark Schlabach, who obviously has known this Georgia program for quite some time, asked Kirby directly about his feeling about the culture around the Georgia program and what the news of this offseason means as we try to process exactly what the Georgia culture is. Here's the question and answer from Smart on that. Once again, ESPN from Friday.
Does your program have a culture problem?
Absolutely not. And I would say we're far from it. Do we have perfect young men and women and players? Not necessarily, but I promise you this, that's the intent, for us to grow these guys and get them better and feel really good about the culture within our program.
So listen, there's obviously a myriad collection of opinions about all the stuff that's gone on with UGA, what it means, what it's all about. It's not necessarily my place here to deliberate all of that with you. You've got your own point of view on that. As I mentioned with John earlier, though, I think the one big question now, one way or another, is this kind of the end of this? Does this begin the process of ending all of this? Smart has spoke. That was the interview there. The Athens police has released their statement. That came last week on the heels of some AJC reporting. Jalen Carter, as I said, has sort of suggested they're going to bring new facts into the public discussion at some point in time. There's a chance we hear more from Devin Willick's family at some point in time. But you sort of wonder in kind of large measure if the story starts to kind of slow down a little bit after this. I certainly would say that's the hope of UGA. So we'll see if that's indeed the way all of this turns out. It's been an awful chapter, and it's more than anything just sad, right? We've never stopped being sad about what happened to Devin and Chandler. And there has been a lot of stuff that's come out, since then that has left us confused in some respects. But have we now learned everything we're going to learn about what all of this was? I guess we'll have to wait and see. But Kirby Smart showing up on Friday to offer that defense of his program. And, of course, we'll try to transition back to our sort of typical fun stuff here to kind of wrap things up here today. And I told you off the top of the program that last year just had a great time on our Dog Nation cruise, sort of celebrating the NFL draft on the final night of the cruise. Looking forward to doing that again. And I love hearing from all of you on board your own Dog Nation cruise. And I love the fact when you guys represent Dog Nation when you go on your cruise. In fact, let's honor this as our golden shoe winner for today. How about High Dog checking in? Got the Dog Nation koozie. I love those swimming trunks. And listen, I don't make a habit of typically comment on another man's swimming trunks, but I do like the standing dog logo kind of repeating on the trunks there. That looks great. Having a great time on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. Thankful to have you check in. And as I told High Dog, I wish I was right there with you. Love to be on board that right now. So glad to see High Dog having a good time. We'll give him a golden shoe, although I think he's so busy enjoying his vacation, I'm not sure he'll even have time to appreciate that. But golden shoe going out nonetheless. Let me tell you who does not have cruise vacations. They don't have fun in the sun. They don't have anything going on. That's the lousy, stinking Gators. And 236 days from right now, it gets even worse. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. And we'll see all of you back here tomorrow. Dog Nation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust Pella on that today. All right, I know I say this sometimes we don't actually achieve it, but we're going to try to do about a hard 15 minutes here. Then after that, we're going to try to get off the air, if at all possible. So let's get in here. Let's have a spirited discussion, and let's try to hop back off for about 15 minutes. All right, I'm going to start on Facebook today because I feel like I started on YouTube on Friday. On Facebook here for a moment. Let's see what's going on. Let's see what else. Gregory Nowak checks in to say no sympathy for the ACC. Let me read this. He says no sympathy for the ACC. We were talking about this a moment ago, or any of their schools. Read their media rights deal. They voluntarily chose to lock themselves into an ironclad commitment to the league and took the long-term deal as a strategy. Now certain schools are crying no fair. Yeah, it's interesting, Gregory, because on the one hand, the contract is both probably the best and worst thing the ACC has going for it. It's clearly a bad financial deal compared to the rest of college athletics, but the ironclad nature, to use your words, of the contract is probably the thing that sort of held the ACC together. In other words, this is one of those things where I think a lot of the ACC folks were wise enough to realize, hey, if we don't get a strong contract in place, if we don't make it very, very punitive to try to get out of the league, then we're going to probably not have a league. So, that's probably been the thing that's benefited most of the member institutions. There are schools like Florida State that feel like they can get a better deal. But this is not me trying to be snarky or like SEC homer guy, whatever else. I'm just not honestly quite so sure that's the case. I mean, here's the thing I'd love to have somebody in very simple terms explain to me. Would the SEC make more money by putting Florida State in this league right now? And maybe the answer is, yeah, it would. Maybe that's the case. Or maybe the answer is, well, the SEC might not make more money for Florida State, but it'd be kind of geographic expansion from the Big Ten, so therefore they'd like to have Florida State. Maybe that's the case there too. And maybe that is the answer, that they're more attracted to the Big Ten than they are the SEC because of the fact the SEC already has so much of Florida locked up. But even with that, I'm not quite so sure. Like, we're kind of reached a point where conference expansion, I don't know how much more sense it makes for leagues like the SEC and the Big Ten, who've already kind of grown to 16. If they thought they'd make more money, they'd grow to 40. But I'm just not quite so sure they make more money on the basis of the expansion that's out there, unless this really is an example of, hey, it seems like Florida State should be in the SEC, but they're actually a better fit for the Big Ten because this is a part of the country the Big Ten currently isn't in. I'm not quite so sure. But some of those wild predictions years ago about one day there being super leagues and, whatever else, I mean, it certainly seems like, that's a possibility of where all this is heading. Let's see what else. Pete Williams says, before my grandmother passed away, she would only drink Coke out of the 8-ounce glass bottles. I will say this. I think soda out of a bottle tastes really, really good. Really good. And, I'm old enough to remember, like the bottle you go get in the convenience store, like sort of the handheld bottle, 16 ounces, whatever it is. Maybe it's more than that, 16 ounces, whatever. Like, when I was a kid, even in high school, those bottles were glass. They didn't start changing those over to plastic until, I was whatever, probably late high school. They started making, finally making those plastic. Soda and stuff like that just tastes way better out of glass. It does, especially like I'm a Dr. Pepper guy. That's my favorite soft drink. But that sort of contour shaped Coke bottle, that's hard to beat. That is a good taste. That is a good tasting thing. Let's see what else. Ken Holcomb says he believes that adding Texas and Oklahoma for the SEC are enough for now. Yeah, I mean, and the funny thing about that is like when Texas and Oklahoma first came to the SEC, certainly our audience, I think a lot of the SEC audience, like it wasn't necessarily received as good news. Like there wasn't a lot of like pro SEC chest thumping of, oh, look how big and bad the SEC is. They went and annexed the two best programs in the Big 12. Even someone like me who's, pretty big SEC homer, a lot of you who are, pretty big SEC types, this wasn't necessarily celebrated as necessarily great news. In other words, I don't care about the ACC, but do I want the ACC to disband? I don't really care about the Pac-12, but do I want there to be no more Pac-12? Maybe you don't care. Maybe that's the right way to be, but I certainly don't know that I'm going to be standing on the sideline here rooting for the demise of these conferences. I just don't know that's the case. Lucy Bowers Boykin and Bill Sanders talking about putting some peanuts in that Coke. My dad used to do that for sure. My dad used to do that. My dad used to always just do a weird thing where you put salt in his orange juice, which I thought was weird. But the peanuts in the Coke thing, I've definitely seen a lot of that. Definitely seen a lot of that. All right. Yeah. Michael, the producer, talking about putting the Coke float together, where like you get the ice cream. I've never actually had a float, but I do know they're very popular. Very popular. Let us see what else. Bubba wants to drop Vandy from the SEC. You know, like Vanderbilt in the SEC, Northwestern in the Big Ten, and things like that. Their place in the leagues has always been really secure because of the fact that the other schools like the connection to this sort of fancy pants, private academic type thing. But the more this really becomes not even about school at all, like one day in the future, the players may not even be required to be students. If I'm a Vanderbilt, that makes me pretty nervous. If I'm a Northwestern, that makes me pretty nervous of. The less this becomes about academics, the fact that you're some sort of fancy pants academic school just matters a whole lot less. I also think there's a chance that one day some of these fancy schools may just drop sports altogether. I could totally see Vanderbilt doing that. Because there's a small handful of schools that don't need the prestige of athletics to remain prestigious. And at a place like Stanford, for instance, I think they believe their actual enrollment spots to the general population are worth more than the athletic scholarship is worth anyway, because you see people going to prison to try to get your kids into Stanford. I could see some of these fancy pants schools just dropping athletics altogether, and I really do believe that's a possibility sooner rather than later. But the other thing is, the idea of, hey, why don't you just drop Vandy? Well, in the past, that's a total non-starter because the other presidents like the idea of hobnobbing with the Vanderbilt president because it makes them feel smarter by proxy. But the less this becomes about academics in the future, the more you don't need the fancy pants private school unless they're bringing something to the league other than just being a cool road trip. Let's see what else. Cassie Turner says, I have a hard time letting go of any rivalries. I'm right there with you on that, Cassie, for sure. Paul Moon says, switch Vanderbilt for my Deacons. Let's go. That'd be interesting. A little Winston-Salem. That'd be interesting. Let's see what else. Kenneth Holt says Vanderbilt would be a better fit for the ACC other than their baseball team. They usually have a pretty good baseball team. Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's like Vanderbilt in baseball is the version of the SEC that, exists in a lot of other sports, certainly in football, whereas not only are they typically very good, they've got one of the longest streaks in the country of like top 25 recruiting class. They're a very good recruiting program. They've had a lot of very good players. Everybody also hates them too. I mean, Vanderbilt is hated in baseball. Tennessee's kind of the new most hated team in the SEC, but Vanderbilt's been hated for a long time. It's so weird how they're viewed in baseball as kind of this big team, a lot of success. A lot of their guys have gone on to Major League Baseball, totally arrogant, completely disliked. The Vandy Whistler doesn't help on any of that. It's just they're viewed in baseball. So, to the small number of people that kind of follow baseball compared to football, Vanderbilt is viewed so differently. Jonathan Aaron said, random question, would I take 10 chops from Ric Flair for $1,000? No, I would not. There are a lot of moves that I would potentially take because there is a way to take them. When it comes to like a Flair chop, there really is only one way to take that, and that's just to take it. And, Flair's really chopping you. And in some cases, that does hurt. I mean, there have been guys that had gotten the skin broken because of one of those Flair chops. So if I was going to take something, I'm not going to take something that really is a thing. I'm going to take something different. By the way, AEW pay-per-view last night. I think we have a true star on the rise. What's his name? Is it MJF? Is that his name? The new bad guy in AEW. I think this is the new star. I really do. I think this is the new star in pro wrestling right now, for sure. I didn't watch the pay-per-view, but just kind of following some of the stuff online, I see some of his promos, things like this is like a true classic bad guy. Like this is a very good, bad guy, and he goes out, gets the win last night against Bryan Danielson. He also, I saw this online, and I promise I'll stop talking about wrestling after this. He poured water on a kid And I think everybody sort of thought it was like a plant, and come to find out it wasn't. That he actually poured water on a real fan, and the kid was like upset about it, which is kind of funny. So I didn't do this today, but I'm going to probably do this week, Paul, on some of the chatter that's out there about Dylan Raiola. And I know he was with Peyton Woodyard some this weekend, and that seems like it's good for Georgia. But then you've got some pretty strong chatter connecting Raiola and USC. So, yeah, that certainly kind of bubbled up quick. I didn't have time for that today, but we're going to try to get to that at some point in time. And it does sort of seem not so great. And I don't quite know what to make of it yet. But yeah. Let's see what else. WHP says, if you're Raiola, why would you pick the Dogs over L.A.? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, Georgia's won the last 2 national championships, so clearly this is not a remote outpost for college football, I guess. Paul Moon also says, I'm happy with Puglisi, but I'd like to add I would say they're going to look to add 2 quarterbacks, whether it be Raiola and Puglisi or a guy like Jake Merklinger, who I know they've also offered. I would think this has a very strong chance of being a 2-quarterback class for UGA. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a moment. Senior Dog 54 says the 6-ounce Coke in the bottle is the best soft drink ever invented. Do enjoy that. Kent Holcomb also likes the Coke floats. He says, I think my grandmama invented them when I was a kid in the late 50s. You love that. Hemingway also says the soft drinks in the plastic bottles seem to go flat. Yeah, I mean, this is just fact. Like, drinks taste like the thing you drink them out of. They just do. And, that's just a fact. You drink something out of a nice glass bottle, it's going to taste, kind of like that. If you drink something out of an aluminum can, it tastes completely different. You drink something out of a plastic, whatever, it tastes completely different. What you drink it out of affects the way that it tastes. Senior Dog 54 says, I would not hesitate to draft Stetson Bennett in the 2nd or the 3rd round if I were an NFL team in need of a quarterback, even as a backup, because they almost always playing with all the quarterback injuries in the league. Yeah, I think based on kind of what you've seen this weekend, going along with the career performance at Georgia, the idea of that being kind of a day 2 pick, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Let's see what else. Red Dog 1 on the subject of the Fansville commercials. So I do realize, I use the word redundant. I do realize they're on all the time. I will say, though, to me, that's the best national campaign around college football I've ever seen. It's obvious they're done by like real fans that kind of know the storylines around the sport. I think it's the best national campaign I've probably ever seen. Don Jones says the networks have zero incentives to support shorter games. They want eyeballs for them as long as they can keep them. Yeah, they don't want less commercials, but I don't think they hate the idea of shorter games because think about this. So the first kickoffs are at noon Eastern time. The last kickoffs are at like 10 Eastern time, right? Like 7 Pacific, 10 Eastern, something like that. Hawaii oftentimes a little bit later. So they want a whole day's worth of college football. Shorter games do make it easier to kind of cram more games into the schedule because you got noon, basically got noon, 3, 6, 9. Let's say you basically have 4 TV windows with about an hour overlap either side. So 4 TV windows, fitting as much inventory as you can within those four sort of TV windows. It's one of the things that makes college football really valuable is the fact that you've got, those slots to kind of plug in pretty popular programming because, a Pac-12 game on at 10 o'clock at night, you can laugh and say that's too late, whatever else, but it more than gets enough ratings to justify its spot on ESPN when it's there. Same thing for the stuff at noon. People complain about playing at noon. Those noon games do very well on TV. So you get this long TV window. So the shorter games make it a little bit easier, kind of keep them slotted in those time slots, and they don't have to ask for less commercials. This is less, kind of sort of dead space within the game. But ultimately, this may be the one thing in college athletics that's not completely governed by TV. This may be governed by an even more unsavory character than a TV executive. This may be governed by lawyers. No, all in good fun to my lawyer friends. But I believe that in a lot of ways football is playing defense against litigation for head injuries and things like that. And so by taking the attempt to shorten some games, especially when you are on the verge of adding games to your season, showing some sort of good faith effort to try to reduce the amount of contact during the game is probably a way of playing defense against future litigation. A lot of things in life that turn out to be about that, I believe that's there as well. DT on the subject of the fact that Brian Bosworth is sheriff of Fansville. Yeah, you love the idea of a guy like that who had such a distinguished football career, dedicating himself to law enforcement. I think that's a great thing. I do. West GA Dog Fan brings up a good point. He says, I try to limit my wrestling talk, but you better believe if Georgia can go for 3-23, when we get to go for 4-24, that's going to be this. I mean, there is no doubt go for 4-24 is going to be the Four Horsemen symbol because diamonds are forever, and Georgia football is there as well. So West GA Dog Fan is 100% on the money on that. Kenneth Holt says the same people that thought Bryce Young was 6 feet also believe that Anthony Richardson's worth the first-round pick. Y'all see the picture of Bryce Young with those platform shoes? Reminded me of two things. Speaking of wrestling, this is like a notorious thing in pro wrestling because you've always got wrestlers trying to make themselves taller. And so if you ever go to see wrestling live, some of the boots the wrestlers wear, I swear, like the sole support's about that thick because they're trying to make themselves, as tall as they can possibly be. And Bryce Young's shoes, the combine, remind me of that. But it also kind of reminded me of the thing. Did you ever have those like platform shoes when you're in high school that if you ran on them, it's supposed to strengthen your calf muscles? That's what this sort of reminded me of there as well. Let's see what else. D. Mart says glad Stequavius showed up at the combine. His D-ball is one of the prettiest we've seen him throw. Yeah, I thought it was great. And I absolutely do agree with what D. Mart says. I just believe that Stetson Bennett full stop is better than Will Levis. I just do. Master MJ911 says over under 3.5 first-round picks from Georgia. I believe I would have taken the under on that just a few days ago, but after the combine, I believe I'm over on that now. I believe you've got to consider the possibility of 4, a very real possibility, and the potential of 5 being real there as well. Alan Hampton says, I'm all for reducing the length of games. As a studies show, from the snap to the whistle, there's approximately 12 to 18 minutes of action in a 4-hour college game. Yeah, it's really weird when you whittle it down that way, how much of – it's sort of like if you play golf, like the old cliche is, if you got a tree standing in your way, if the tree is 90% air, so you might as well try to hit through it, which is typically doesn't work out in my favor. It's the same thing for college football game. We love college football, but 90% of college football is nothing happening. We don't really think of it that way because we're always waiting for that next play, but there is a lot of college football that's not football. Alan's kind of right about that. I think the average fan is kind of okay with the stuff that's being kicked around. I do think it probably favors underdogs a little bit. I think that if you're a betting person, the over-under bet, the total number of points, is it exceeded? Is it less than that? You'll probably see the sort of the pre-flop action trend in the direction of unders a little bit. You'll probably see lower totals established because of this. So it may have an impact on gambling. It might slightly benefit underdogs a little bit more because, smaller sample size gives a chance for crazier things to happen. Paul Moon also mentioned the TV timeouts. Yeah, they're not going anywhere. And some of the cynical people in the media are like, well, fans complain about TV timeouts so they don't stop watching. That's true. I mean, no one's threatening not to watch over TV timeouts, but TV timeouts are the one thing that fans don't like. You don't like them in the stadium. There's nothing worse than when Sanford Stadium's like a fever pitch and the action's so intense and there's such great energy, and then the TV timeout comes. You do kind of take some of the air out of the balloon a little bit. If you're watching at home, you probably going to get frustrated with that from kind of time to time there as well. I mean, I would say I'm in the category of someone who loves college football so much you sort of overlook that part of it. Most people devote their whole day to college football anyway, so, the length of the game is whatever it is. But, it'd be nice to kind of tighten that up a little bit. They are never doing that, though. Bubba says timeouts are even worse when you're in the stadium and it's hot. I'd say that's the case. I would agree with that. All right, final comments, and we're going to get out of here. Back on Facebook for a second. Rick Wallace says, I want to run out and tackle the TV timeout, dude, which I understand. What's funny, though, is like the high school games that we do, because, every college game's on TV, so you get very used to, like, the person they call it, this is a little bit of TV lingo if you want to hear this. They call it the red hat, and the person that controls the TV timeouts typically wears a red hat because it makes it easy for the referee to see. And so that's someone's job on a TV crew. They are the red hat. They run out there and they do that. Well, in college football, every game's on TV. In high school football, there's only 2 games televised per week. You better believe when one of our games on TV and that red hat runs out there, when high school games are sort of used to, hey, we just let's keep it going, keep it moving, and you can't do that on a Friday night, and in some cases the game's 42-0. That is not always well received. Let's see what else. Lucy Bowers Boykin checking out. Appreciate that. Bill Sanders, very funny line. Rick Wallace, I do agree with you. I do not like the fact the national championship is on the one night of the or on a night of the year that the college season never takes place on a Monday night. I've never been a fan of that. They obviously do it that way because of the NFL, but I am not a fan of that for sure. Hemingway likes to go to the kitchen, get a snack, or go take care of what he says Mother Nature demands during those commercial breaks, which obviously kind of works out pretty well. DT may have the comment of the day. He says Bryce Young gets his shoes where Nick Saban gets his hair colored. DT, that is very, very funny. Richard D's like the idea of having another DawgNation Days of Summer event with the Braves. Boy, I like the idea of that too, Richard. That sounds really, really good. That sounds really good there as well. Fun to think about warm weather and Braves baseball, all that kind of stuff coming up here really soon. Exciting to think about all of that. Hey, we appreciate you being with us here today for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down there as well. Y'all go to rsandrews.com to find your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price that's promised, including getting that air conditioning unit ready for the spring that's going to be on its way. You can find out more about that online, rsandrews.com. Also, check out our friends at the AJC online, ajc.com. So there's an update to the AJC. I haven't read this story, but it's worth your time. Update from the AJC about the legislation that potentially legalizes sports wagering in Georgia. You can get an update on that. Also in the AJC, great story on the Kennesaw State Owls, who punched their ticket for the very first time to the NCAA men's basketball tournament, the only school from our state likely to make the tournament. So congratulations to them on that. Another story I'm looking forward to reading more on the AJC at some point in time too. Did y'all see the thing from John Buchagras from ESPN? I think this is on Friday. Bucci saying that the NHL could be coming back to Atlanta, which would obviously be a third time for the league here in Atlanta. And he says it could be out in Alpharetta, which I think could be very interesting. I'd be a fan of that. I would like that. So you can find out more about that there as well. Also, Ronald Acuna playing in the World Baseball Classic. I don't know how thrilled the Braves are about that, but you can read more about that. And I'll look at Michael Harris Jr. during spring practice, which is kind of cool there too. So not spring practice, spring training. You know what I'm saying. So all of that online, ajc.com. Check out R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com. It's not just air conditioning units. If your water heater goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace that for you the same day there too. So we got to go. We'll talk to you tomorrow. R.S. Andrews Cool Down, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We will see you then.